to America and made history, quite literally, with his writing about slavery and then his work to create Central Park. Now, this is odd, perhaps, to contrast Central Park with Yosemite. Maybe, maybe not. Both are major parts of Olmsted's legacy. Central Park was under construction during the Civil War, and I was talking to the man who wrote the book on Olmsted and Yosemite. I was pointing out that here in the South, we were doing different things in 1861 than building a 600-acre park. Maybe we should have been. That would have been a nice start. And Central Park was under construction during the Civil War, and had 2 million visitors in 1862. 2 million visitors. Do you think that bespeaks a need for a park for the general public? Rolf talked about the role that the central government, that a strong central government played in the creation of both Central Park as well as Yosemite. It was a revelation. And of course, in his book, he outlines how, okay, there was this secession, and all of a sudden the opposition party is just not in Congress. You don't have to vote against them. So the legislations that you wanted to pass went through like a dream, while a nightmare was unfolding in other places. But it was that sort of legislation that helped with the creation of Yosemite and also helped change attitudes about land policy. Some for the good, some for not. Olmsted's first residential suburb was Riverside, Illinois, designed in 1869. This is 7 miles outside of the Chicago Loop, and it's about 1,400 acres, which is maybe, oddly, maybe not, about the size of the Yosemite Valley, but just keep that 1,400 acres in mind. There's a juxtaposition between the rigidity of the railroad line that you can see, the one straight line on the page that's not the frame of the image itself. That's the railroad heading across the prairie out of Chicago, and it crosses the sinuous path of the Des Plaines River, which cuts a deep channel in these rich soils. There's an interplay between the railroad, the river, and the parkland that Olmsted has preserved around it in a floodplain long before there was any regulation that said you should do so. The road pattern, with this very mysterious paisley pattern, has streets recurving on each other on what is otherwise a generally flat plain. And it is through that very curvature, it's not just a whimsy on his part, it is his way of controlling the vistas that you experience as you drive through the neighborhood. And if you get to Chicago, sure, go see Oak Park. It's incredible. Go to Riverside. There you get to see Olmsted with the overlay of Frank Lloyd Wright, and it is breathtaking. Riverside's younger and somewhat shyer sister is our own Druid Hills, which began its life as the Kirkwood Land Development Company. Hurt and Olmsted began their own creative dance on the land that Hurt had assembled between Atlanta and Decatur at a time when Buckhead was quite literally not on the map. Now, I have to profess a certain jingoistic orientation. I was born in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta, and the way Hurt and Olmsted thought of Druid Hills was from Atlanta to Decatur, as opposed to reading right to left. They were reading left to right, so I continue that. So Atlanta is in the circle down at the bottom, and Decatur is on the right. The green area, the polygon in the middle, is 1,400 acres. Oh, there's that number again. The size of Riverside, the size of Yosemite. And the 3 images, or the 3 red symbols on the left, the red star is where Brookwood Station is now. The red triangle is where the Cathedral of St. Philip is now. And the arrow points to Jalisco's, a very famous Mexican restaurant in Buckhead. But Buckhead is unnamed and not on the map, and so take that, Buckhead. The northernmost street on this map that is about, that's about 7th Street. And so now Jenny, I'm going to turn the microphone onto her, and she will introduce you to Hurt and a host of other characters and help populate Druid Hills, and maybe she'll delve into the scam and scandal.
Well, thank you all for coming. Censor just mentioned Joel Hurt, and he was the person who gave us Olmsted in Atlanta. Joel Hurt was an amazing person. He had some character flaws as well, but we won't go into that today. He was a railroad surveyor, so he was just like Sherman. He knew the railroads and he knew Atlanta. And he decided that he was going to build the first suburb in Atlanta, which was Inman Park, which is still there and has been restored beautifully. And then when he did that, he decided he would buy the 1,400 acres, that number again, and he would build his second suburb. He was also doing things like building buildings downtown, such as the Hurt building, which is still standing, and other buildings that unfortunately have been torn down. He was extremely interested in botany and plants, so he and Olmsted hit it off right away. He had heard of Olmsted many times in his travels, and he decided that he was going to hire Mr. Olmsted to come down here and plan his suburb and also the landscaping for his suburb. So it's not just the linear park that Olmsted designed. It's most of Druid Hills, the oldest parts, the roads that you think of, Springdale, Oakdale, Fairview Road. Those roads were original and planned and landscaped by Olmsted. Some of the later ones, like the what we call the college streets, Emory roads, and so forth, those were not. So Mr. Olmsted was at Biltmore. He was designing that little cottage up there's landscaping that George Washington Vanderbilt had built. And so he rode down to Atlanta on the train at Mr. Hurt's invitation. And the idea was to come down here and have Olmsted design an ideal residential suburb. And so he had the land, and he had Olmsted, and so Olmsted was here, and they began taking pictures and doing drawings and coming up with what could be this ideal residential suburb. And they did a lot of their oh, thank you, I forgot to do that. I'm sorry, can I go backwards one? I'm not used to technology. Okay, so in this slide, you'll see Joel Hurt as a young man up at the top. And you'll see Joel Hurt as an older man with a white mustache, looking very dapper. And then there in the middle, you'll see the Hurt building, which is still standing. And you'll see one of the main streets of Inman Park and the Glenn home, where Flora Glenn Candler wasn't Candler then, but she grew up and later married Howard Candler and became a rich Coca-Cola person. And her house is in that row. So the next one, what we'll do? Okay. I got it, thank you. Okay, so the next one is Joel Hurt and the biggest real estate transaction that had ever occurred in Atlanta. It was $500,000, and we're talking lots and lots of money in that day's time. Hurt's vision and Olmsted's realization of the plan were absolutely brilliant. But after the senior Olmsted's death in 1903, the commission was handled by Olmsted's sons and his firm. The two sons, Frederick Jr. and John Charles Olmsted, were down here again taking pictures and doing things like drawing up the maps that Olmsted had already produced, but they were making them easier to use. Joel Hurt had spent a lot of money on this project. He didn't really think about infrastructure such as sewer, water, and all that sort of thing, and grading of roads. He was a rich man, but he was also getting older. And so he made a decision to sell to what we call a consortium or a syndicate, not the mafia, but a syndicate, led by Asa Candler. And you'll see Asa in all of his kind of grim face there, right at the top. And to the left, you'll see the Adair brothers, who would be hired as the sole real estate agents for the new project. And then below you'll see the lemon pie house, which was Asa Candler's home on Ponce de Leon, still standing. And at $210,000 when it was built, was the most expensive house built in Atlanta, right across from Springdale Park. So in 1908, the syndicate of new owners bought the property and began building the infrastructure. The first house built was that of Judge John Candler, who was Asa's uncle, and that's where the Druid Hills United Methodist Church is or used to be. It's now been turned into condos. Judge Candler's home, built in 1909, was the first house in Druid Hills torn down, and it was also the first house built. And there have been some others to follow suit since that time. Asa Candler was very generous with his money. Whoops, I gotta go back. He helped really fund Emory University and bring it here. Emory at Oxford was in Oxford, Georgia. It was a junior college, is what we would call it, or a 2-year college. So he brought big Emory up here with a gift of $1 million to get it started and land for it to be on. And then he was a huge donor to Emory throughout his life. Also built Wesley Memorial Hospital, now known as Emory Healthcare on Clifton. And he just gave lots and lots of money away to different causes. He built the Druid Hills Golf Club, which he called a gentleman's club, meaning there were no women members unless you were married to a member. And he also developed part of Emory Village and Candler Park. Some of the founders of the Druid Hills Golf Club had a big decision to make. 14-year-old Bobby Jones won the first grand championship of that golf club. That was in 1913, and Bobby was 14. But right after the tournament, the board met to think and discuss eliminating teenagers from playing in the club championship. They didn't want that to happen again. But that measure failed, and Bobby Jones's trophy is located at the Sea Island Golf Club today. When Mr. Candler was elected mayor of Atlanta, which he served for 2 years, he didn't even take a salary because he didn't need the money. He was the richest man in Atlanta by far. Until he sold the Coca-Cola company or gave it to his children in 1917. But that was later sold by $25 million to Robert Woodruff's family. By the teens and early 20s, many, many prominent citizens has moved to Druid Hills, many along the linear park. And unlike some residential and business developments in Atlanta, Asa Candler, because he had many friends in the Jewish community, did not restrict Jews from Druid Hills. And many very wealthy and prominent Jews built in Druid Hills. The Montags come to mind. The Elsises of Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill come to mind. And all of these people would hire famous architects such as Neil Reed or Walter T. Downing to build their mansion and estate and use the grounds that Olmsted had designed, or hire someone to do their garden for them. There was a talk at one point about not having a linear park and just building houses there. But the Olmsted firm was really adamant. They said, if you put that there, every rich person in Atlanta is going to want to have a house beside it, and they were right. But as time passed and the original owners moved on, many of those big mansions became derelict, and they were split into boarding houses and houses, apartments, that kind of thing. And then later on in the 50s and 60s, 2 things happened to change the character of Ponce de Leon Avenue. The first was the zoning of apartment limited, or AL, which allowed, believe it or not, high rises on Ponce de Leon. And the second one was another thing that the city did, which allowed historic structures to be demolished, existing homes to be repurposed as schools, churches, that sort of thing. And even high-rise apartments that were being thought about, one at the corner of Oakdale Road and Clifton, and Ponce de Leon, which would have been a high-rise old folks' home. So now these houses could be demolished, and you could build a gas station or a skyscraper or whatever you wanted. And the city had no incentive to help with this, because the more stuff was built, the more tax money they got. So I want to take you on just a very brief walking tour of the park. If you get the book, you'll find that everything on the park is detailed as to its history. But this one is the first house that Paideia School built. that Heyday School bought in 1971, and it's called the Davison Harris home. Davison owned Davison's department store, and when he sold that to the Macy family, Mr. Harris bought it, and he was Atlanta Paper Company. And so you see this beautiful Tudor revival home at the corner of Fairview Road and Fairview Road and Fairview and Ponce. And then you have children playing in the garden over there on the left-hand corner, and on the right-hand corner, designed by Robert Cridlin, who designed some other gardens in Atlanta. The Heyday School, as I said, bought the house in 1971, and since that time they've bought a number of other mansions and structures along Ponce de Leon. If you look on the next slide, this is the Hoyt Venable home, also known as Stonehenge and the St. John Lutheran Church. It's at the corner of Oakdale Road in Ponce de Leon. It's made out of Stone Mountain granite. The walls are extremely thick, and the reason that it's made out of the granite is that Mr. Venable and his family owned several mountains, including Stone Mountain and Klondike Mountain. So it just seemed natural for them to build their house out of Stone Mountain granite. The next house is called Glenwood's, and you'll see the aerial view of two houses, which I'll talk about in a moment, but Glenwood's is on your right. And then as you look at the aerial view, if you look to the left, you'll see the Lucy Candler Hines and Henry Hines estate, which we'll get to in a little bit. But on the right-hand side, you'll see the 9 acres of garden that were part of Glenwood's. The house was sitting on 1 acre, and the other 9 acres were gardens, and you can see the design of the mazes and the boxwoods and the rose garden. There were also a stone chapel, a stone bridge, waterways. It was an amazing place. And unfortunately, that is gone. That's one of our huge losses along Ponce de Leon. Where the 9 acres of gardens are now is all condominiums. Mr. Dodson, who owned and built the house along with his wife Clara, made a fortune selling patent medicines, most of which were alcohol. At a time during Prohibition, that was very popular. And they were guaranteed to cure any problem that you had, and he advertised nationally. And of course, not too long, the U.S. government decided that they were going to go after him for false advertising, and they pretty much shut him down. And then not long after that, he died. But the money was still there, and his widow lived there 29 years after he passed away. Let's see. So these are pictures of, on your left and right. Left is the Cater Wolford Garden. Cater Wolford and his brother, Guy Wolford, built a company called Retail Credit, and it was a group that decided whether you as an individual were liable to pay back your bill to the grocery store or wherever or not. And if you were not, they weren't going to give you any credit. And if you were good risk, then you could have credit. So that's how we got Equifax. And Cater made unlimited money doing this, and he also loved gardening. So he hired also Robert Cridlin to produce this incredible garden in front of his mansion, which you can see in the far distance left of center. It has columns on the front of it. And this whole property is now part of a school for children. But all of that stuff in front, the bridges, the floodplain areas, the creeks, the incredible amount of stuff that's there is just unbelievable, and it's all preserved, and it's all still down there if you're in the area. The picture on the right shows the gates of Jacqueline, which is the name of Cater Wolford's estate. They're open to the public. And as I said, a school for physically and mentally challenged children is now on that whole property. The next one is the Druid Hills Golf Club, in two views you might not have seen because the golf club burned down in 1925 and East Lake burned down. I don't think there was a connection, but there might have been. Somebody that didn't like golf, maybe. While the golf club was burning to the ground, the golfers were out on the golf course continuing to shoot their golf balls or hit their golf balls while the embers were burning. And the little dog mascot was rescued by firemen from the clubhouse. What you see on the left, you'll see from Ponce de Leon Avenue, but that's the back of the club. Even though today, with all the automobiles stopping under the porte cochere, that's the back. The front is the other picture. It faces the golf course. It was designed by E.E. Doherty, who also designed Stonehenge, the Venable home, and he designed the Druid Hills Baptist Church as well. Many, many prominent citizens, all the leaders of the community, joined Druid Hills, East Lake, Capital City, Piedmont, all those clubs. They were all in all those clubs. It was cheaper back then, I think. And even had Metropolitan Opera stars coming in to give performances at that golf club. Now what you see on the far next slide is Twin Oaks. This was owned by the Willis family. It's now demolished. It was at the corner of Clifton Road, across from the golf club, and Ponce de Leon, which is in the foreground. And Mr. Willis was the one who designed, real close to us right here, Avondale Estates, Georgia. And that's considered today the best example of Tudor Revival store architecture or shopping area architecture in the nation. And it looked down on its heels for a while, but it's looking really good now. And the next house over is the family of Alfred Urey, who wrote the play called Driving Miss Daisy, and later there was a film made of that. And then we're going to come to Lucy Candler Hines. This house is called Rainbow Terrace, designed by Lloyd Preacher. It's an incredible place, and it's just it's filled with tragedy and lots of intrigue. Lucy Candler was Asa Candler's only daughter, and she had a tragic life. Her first husband died during the flu epidemic. Her second husband, Mr. Hines, was murdered in the library of this house during a home invasion, a robbery attempt. And she never lived in the house again after that time. And she moved out and then later married Enrico Lighty, who was the first conductor of the Atlanta Symphony, and then they moved to New York. So after Lucy moved out, it became a boarding house, and it was just a mess. And finally, it was abandoned and stood open for something like 30 years. And you don't have to raise your hand, but I bet many of you here went in that house. I know I did. Ken is confessing back there. It was just an amazing place. It was vandalized. Everything that was not nailed down was taken. You can see it in the picture that Lloyd Preacher took of it on the left, and then down below with the dogwoods blooming, the gates looking over to Shadyside Park. And next, Pine Bloom, another one of our famous people, Preston Arkwright. He was both the president of Georgia Power and Atlanta Gas Light. Pine Bloom was the name of his wife, who was the governor's daughter, Dorothy Colquitt. Her family had a plantation in South Georgia called Pine Bloom, and that's why this is named Pine Bloom. It was because he was the president of both the gas company and the electric company. The first floor was wired for electricity and also gas. And I guess he was waiting to see which one took off. So after the Arkwrights moved out, Mr. Arkwright died, and they sold the house to the Georgia Baptist Convention, and the Baptist Radio Group moved into the home, and they broadcast the Baptist Hour from the third floor ballroom of this house. And then later on, they had a studio up there. And finally, the Jackson Hill Church bought the property and built a very large sanctuary on the right-hand side of the house, which is now gone. And they used the house itself as also a Sunday school and meeting area. And then today it's been purchased by a developer, and there'll be 19 condominiums built around the property, and also I think 4 inside. And finally, 2 of my favorite stories. The derelict-looking white house on the top left and bottom left was the home of Rankin Smith's family, and he owned the Falcons, among other things. He made his money in insurance, and he bought the Falcons for very little and sold them for a million times that much money. So money wasn't an object. The Rankin Smith Theater at Fernbank is named for him, and he helped raise money for that. But unfortunately, the person who bought the house after him decided they wanted to build a filling station on the property. And so there was battle after battle, and I think I went to most of them, downtown with Urban Design Commission to not let this home be torn down. So in the late 70s, it caught fire, And the first fire was blamed on hobos and derelicts that had moved into the property. And the firemen came out and put it out, and it really wasn't damaged that much. The second fire occurred on a weekend and basically burned everything that could burn. And the fire department decided that that fire was caused by an electrical device that had gone wrong. The only problem was the electricity to the house had been turned off for years. And so we all in the neighborhood think that someone burned it down, along with the other house, Paradiso, which you'll see the front door of, and then a picture during its derelict time of being vandalized. Paradiso was a Louis Edmund Crook design, absolutely gorgeous, one of my favorite houses in the neighborhood. The Finn Stone family, which owned a number of bakeries, had this built. They also had a house at Lakemont and one on an island in Miami. And Paradiso also burned. We were trying to save it. Georgia Conservancy was interested, but the owners were holding out for a high-rise. And fortunately, that was never built, but now we do have condos where Paradiso is, El Paradiso. The townhomes are called Paradiso, which is incorrect. It's El Paradiso. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the Olmsted Park and what happened to it after it was built. And I'm talking about intrusions and threats into the design. And you'll see on that first slide, that is the Garden Club, Low-Water Garden Club's stone fountain that was built as a memorial to some of the members who had passed away or their husbands. And it had azaleas and ferns, and those look like, well, they look like pineapples. I don't know if they're, what are they? But that was a fountain that worked, and it was there, and it was an intrusion in that, as much as you might like it, it was not Olmstedian. That fountain actually was demolished by the city, and they rebuilt another one, but it was ugly. And then they left the water running in it, and it froze and broke apart. So that was the end of that. So when we were building, when we were doing the plans for the Olmsted Park, we had to deal with the Druid Hills Garden Club and ask their permission to remove these things that they had put in, such as the garden, and there was a rose garden around it, and trails and memorial dogwoods. And they still have a presence in the park today. They still plant dogwoods in memory of their members. If you look at the picture of the little bridge, that was probably added during the WPA, during the Roosevelt era, because they were doing a lot of work like that, and there is a wishing well and a rock garden in the park as well. And they're intrusions. We've kept them because they're historic, but they're not Olmstedian. And below you'll see two particularly non-Olmstedian things. The swing set, thank you, City of Atlanta, for that, and the baseball diamond or softball diamond, and then another playscape that was put in by the Howard School, which at that time was on Ponce de Leon. Now we're going to talk about probably the worst intrusion that almost took the park away. The biggest threat was an expressway, proposed as early as 1946 through the linear park and other historic areas. The transportation plan also proposed bus, train, and bikeways, but they were never built. The expressways we now see in Atlanta, such as 20, 75, 85, they're all on what was called the Lautner Plan. That's the 1940s plan. 75 and 85 joined together in downtown Atlanta, which is probably not a good idea as we look at it today, but that's what they decided to do. And when you go through Atlanta, that's almost like a river, isn't it? That huge, huge area of pavement. Later on, other roads such as Georgia 400 and the 285 Perimeter, Stone Mountain Freeway, and even 485, which was also parts of it were not built, were added to the Lautner Plan. And these maps that you see now show what was going to happen. The first one will show down at the bottom, that's 75 and 85 going south, and then the one that's going across is I-20, and then the fork up at the top is 75 and 85 going north. If you look at the middle picture, you'll see that that is, all the yellow and red is the new expressway, the Stone Mountain Expressway that's running right through the heart of Druid Hills and right through the linear park. And I think we established that it would probably be built up on an overpass as it went through Deep Dean Park and also near Fernbank Forest, near the President's Home on Low Water Preserve. It was just going to take everything. there was a sizable gap in what was built originally, the Stone Mountain Freeway. It stops there at North DeKalb Mall or Center, and it stops at the Boulevard Glen Iris exit on the downtown connector. And the DOT hates these gaps, so they were going to fill it, and that's what all this was about. This thing went on for over 20 years, and many court battles and fights and money spent and so forth. And you can see proposed freeway through historic districts right there. And when people began knowing about this, they were outraged because it was taking their house, or in my case, both of my houses. The first house that I owned and the second house that I owned were both in the right-of-way. I don't know why I did that, but I did. Fortunately, neither was torn down. But your own house, but also things of beauty, like running it down the center of the Olmsted Park. Why do that? Because there's nothing to tear down. There are no houses to tear down. So if you look at some of the protests that were going on, we had a tent city that was in Shadyside Park, and we had down below there's a man in a construction outfit that I think might be the Village People, I'm not sure. But he's getting Mary Jane Newsom down off of a big crane, and he doesn't look too friendly about it, does he? And then you have in the middle picture, Atlanta's finest are dragging a nonviolent, peaceful, non-cooperating protester, dragging him off to the police paddy wagon. And they were doing things like cutting down dogwood trees with people in them. And so all these protests were going on all the time. And at the same time, there were things going on like court cases where different neighborhood groups were suing the DOT. And then you'll look at the top picture, that's Susan Hamilton and Betty Knox, both community leaders in Candler Park, and both working for a paper called the Bond Community Star, which covered the road for every single issue that it ever printed. And down below, you'll see a younger and maybe not as smart me. They're standing by Victory for Atlanta Citizens, and the road is dead. So what happened there? We won. We were fighting huge amounts. Very powerful people like Central Atlanta Progress, the governor of Georgia, the former president of the United States, the mayor of Atlanta, and I could go on and on about who we were fighting to stop this road. Finally, one of our own DeKalb Superior judges of Stone Mountain Circuit, Clarence Seeliger, who's just recently retired from office, set out an order saying this is going to be mediated and this road is not going through. So that was in '92, and we mediated, and the road came out butting into Ponce de Leon, but much further towards town than instead of going down through Druid Hills. Well, that took hundreds of demonstrations, but we were all a lot younger then and more agile. And the question then becomes, would we have a caution, which is the group that was fighting it, or would we have a Bond Community Star, or would we have the Roadbusters who did all kinds of nonviolent protest to stop this road? Would we have those today? And I just don't know. I really don't know. We had people that put themselves underneath cranes and climbed up trees and all sorts of things. Why was that? Was it an environmental movement? I really don't know. Was it just the beginnings that we started to see of historic preservation? That no, we didn't want this stuff torn up to build a highway. We later learned that highways, and people were just tired of them destroying downtowns and close-in neighborhoods. So I think that might have been part of it as well. So after hundreds of these demonstrations and thousands of dollars in the court system, it was settled. And the settlement agreement was in favor of Druid Hills. Will have the park and the neighborhood been saved? That's a big question. I don't know. The leftover Georgia Department of Transportation land became a big park called Freedom Park. It's in the shape of an X, and that was because roads going this way and that way with clover leaves and so forth. Be aware that the DOT rarely gives up. And so I don't know. There's nothing to tear down in Freedom Park either, like the houses that were torn down in the 60s. The Freedom Park land was cleared for the highway right-of-way but it's only been leased from the city for 99 years. And we're now in, I think, about 60 or maybe 55 of those years left. So who knows what's going to happen with that land. Will they propose another road? They might. Some years ago, the Georgia Department of Transportation floated a plan that they were going to build the Stone Mountain Expressway, only they were going to build it in a tunnel underground, right through Morningside and Virginia Highland and into Druid Hills. And it would have been a mess too. Fortunately, it was too expensive to build. If we feel like that things are going to be threatened, we may need to begin our protests again. And in the coming decades, it may be necessary to do that, to save historic structures. For example, this building, this beautiful building. What if they wanted to build a freeway through this? Would you come out and tie yourself to the front rail? We've got to find some people that'll be willing to do that. Who wants to be a part of saving historic structures now, including Olmsted Park? There's now research showing that expressways destroyed neighborhoods. They destroyed minority communities, downtowns, and they accelerated white flight to the suburbs. In this country, there's even a movement right now to remove some existing expressways, which is great by me. So with that, I'll turn it over to Spencer. Let's see. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, some of the thoughts Jenny has provided about GDOT never sleeping and what might emerge from their pens next is something I just don't even want to think about, or not for very long. So one of the characters in this saga is a woman pictured here on the slide behind me that is Sally Harbaugh. And Sally Harbaugh lived on Dellwood, on South Ponce, wonderful Tudor Revival house. And she had an inkling that there was something important. And she found her way to Fairstead, which is the home of the Olmsted firm. And it's now a National Historic Landmark. And it is at Fairstead that Sally was able to look first at the Olmsted drawings. Now, there are a couple of images that people see all the time, and we'll see that in a second. But she had the archivist bring out these enormous drawings, and I should show it on the screen. There it is. So there's Sally in the lower left-hand corner, and this is one of the drawings on the left, is one of the drawings that Sally first saw, and she thought, that might be important. So that the numbers have been added, the labels have been added, all the text on the right has been added. So on the lower right-hand corner is that image from the Olmsted firm from 1892 showing this is Atlanta, this is Druid Hills, or the Kirkwood Land Company, and there's Decatur. So again, just to remind you that this is the shape of the piece of land that Hurt assembled, and there's a big gap in that, which is where the number 4 is, and that is the land where Fernbank is now. Olmsted had wanted Hurt to buy that land, but Mr. Harrison, Colonel Harrison, was not selling, and something about a bridge, you can't buy it if you don't, anyway. So we have a gap there. In this plan, the road that became Ponce de Leon, Olmsted is doing what Joel Hurt wanted him to do, which is connect point A to point B. And there's a well-known trick among designers, which is do what you're asked to do, and then show them a better way to do it. And we'll get to that better way. But number 1 there is the wide boulevard that becomes Ponce de Leon. Number 2 is a series of parks along Lowwater Creek. And this is land, again, before floodplain legislation, where Olmsted knows that you don't build here. There are a number of reasons you don't build there. Number 1, it will flood. Number 2, the soils tend to be very, very deep. And to build good foundations in that kind of land, it's really difficult. And as a 96-year-old landscape architect and a dear friend of mine, Edward Darty, said, nobody would buy in that land unless they were a farmer or a fool. And there are more fools born all the time. So number 3 is Deep Dean Park. And this is 1892. Olmsted has put a lasso around that land because it was an old growth forest, and Olmsted recognized, number 1, incredibly difficult to develop the land because of the topography, and number two, the value of the preservation of that land. Even though Atlanta's population was low, the need to preserve that sort of forested land was already apparent to him because his vision was, he was playing the long game a long time ago. Number five is where Clifton Road, the Clifton Turnpike, had pre-existed. But Sally Harbaugh is in Fairstead. They're rolling out these maps. She's standing on top. She didn't have her fur on at the time. She's standing at the top of a 10-foot ladder, trying to take a picture of this, and then trying to contextualize this. What is this that I'm looking at? And she wasn't sure, but she thought maybe it's important. So this is the second concept. It's 1893, and Olmsted has done what he's been asked to do, with it, which is show this is where we'll build the road you want, Joel. And the second concept, this is the way we're going to build the road, and we're going to build it better, because he's divided the roadway and he's put in between the two roads a park, this linear park that goes on for over a mile, and it's composed of these 5 components. He's also dammed and created lakes along Peavine, which is the easternmost lake, or the easternmost body of water coming out of the Cater-Wolford Gardens. And then Lowwater comes out on the left-hand lake, and it goes up and it kind of hooks where the lowland is, where the byway is. And that is the component from the byway down to the bottom of the page. That's the part of the development that is the most like what was built. And then the park going to the north was, again, that floodplain. On the right-hand side is a couple of pictures of the place under construction. And also, there may be difficult to see because I haven't advanced the slide. Yeah, there we go. The images that are under construction. This is in advance of any erosion control measures. There's not a hay bale in sight. There's not a silt fence in sight. You can see the fill slope is gullying like crazy. The Olmsted firm wanted a bridge to be built over that stream. Asa Candler, ever the Methodist, sorry, offending many Methodists here, maybe more cautious with money than even a Presbyterian, offending the rest of the people here. But Hurt was, not Hurt, but Olmsted wanted bridges. Asa was like, no, let's not build a bridge. The bridge was a better idea. On the right-hand side of those two images is part of Springdale Park under construction. The other thing, when there were a lot of Olmsted designers, the big lie was being floated around by one of the people that may or may not have been responsible for trying to burn down one of the houses. But he suggested that Olmsted was a draft dodger and that he never had anything to do with any of this, which I can't even describe truly how I feel about that. But I had a long talk with him about it in front of 200 people in a Fernbank auditorium. It was kind of a point-counterpoint experience. The image on the upper right is what's called, it's a working drawing. It is a staking drawing. And you do not, as a developer, you do not engage a landscape professional to go to that level of detail in a construction document unless you're pretty damn sure you're going to build something. And in this instance, that happens to be the staking drawing that is needed for the creation of the electric trolley line that was the core of the Olmsted Hurt vision. So yes, we have roads. Yes, there's still horses and buggies. But yes, we've got an electric trolley that is running through the core of this neighborhood. The lower right-hand drawing is also a staking drawing for the roadway itself. And these drawings are, 1893, June 21st, 1893. So Hurt was bound and determined to build this stuff. We also have here detailed planting plans. Now again, a lot of times I don't even develop a planting plan until the project is under construction, in part because the vision that someone has of a property changes considerably during the construction process. I would like to say, no, mine doesn't change, but the owner's appreciation of what has been built changes significantly. If the Olmsted firm is doing this level of detailed design, and this is, it's difficult to see, but on the upper left is a planting plan for Springdale Park, and on the right of this image is an inventory of the plants that were being planted in the nursery that were, we believe, somewhere between Oxford Road and Clifton Road in some lowland that's not far from the Emory Village, that they were ordering thousands and thousands of plants to be put into that nursery, then to be brought to the park for construction. Yeah, so here is the evolution. So the bottom image, that's the image that is the sort of the more famous lithograph that everyone always sees. The upper left drawing is the one that it was the first concept. The one on the right, the upper one on the right, is the improved version. And then there's the Panic of 1893. Now, this is before the SEC, before any number of regulations that controlled the economy. Is that working? Anyway, the way it does now. But a financial panic, this would involve runs on the bank. This would involve a hard stop to most any project. And in this instance, Joel Hurt said, stop the presses, put your pens down, and the work on Druid Hill stopped. A lot of the drawing stopped, but up till 1893, they were gangbusters. The Panic of 1893, stop all work. And then Olmsted retires, he dies, and the sons inherit the firm. And you'll notice that there is a direct correspondence between the image on the bottom part of the slide and the image that is in the upper right. It is not plagiarism. It is the inheritor of the firm. The firm just continues. It's sort of like just because Asa Candler sold to Woodruff, or Woodruff retires and Goizueta comes in, Goizueta is not plagiarizing Woodruff's interest in Coca-Cola. It's a continuation of the same company. So the Olmsted son and stepson continue the firm, and when Hurt is ready to sell to Candler, this is the first set of lots that is being put up for sale. So you don't advertise the cheap seats. It's sort of like, remember when we used to go to concerts and buy tickets and you'd be with like hundreds and thousands of other people in the same room to see performances? When you were selling 1,400 acres of land, you want to sell the most expensive land first. Set your market, establish your market, establish the popularity of the place, establish the draw, get the Ritchie-crats in, my word, not Olmsted's. And so that's what you show in your first sales piece. So that this Olmsted denier was saying, see, it's not even Olmsted's name. It's his son and stepson. That's not even Olmsted's name. He's dead by this point. That's true. But it is based on the drawing up above that was right out of Olmsted's hand and Olmsted very much part of the picture. And I'm not sure if you can even read the yellow words, but Briarcliff Road is the far left, then Springdale, Oakdale, Lullwater, Clifton, and then East Lake is down below Deep Dean Park. The lakes, of course, didn't get built, which is a shame because they could indeed help with the mitigation of stormwater as the watersheds have been eutrophied or fully expanded with impervious surface. So, boy, did that? Okay. Jenny talked about the road battle. Once the road battle was won, and God, I hope we've won it, a master plan was essential to guide the restoration, the rehabilitation of the parks. The parks had been ignored, they'd been abused, and they were very nearly demolished. And now, could they be cherished? Could they be brought back to what Olmsted and Hurt first envisioned? The master plan was completed by local landscape architects, along with a New York landscape architect named Nicholas Cornell, as well as Charlie Beveridge, who was the longtime editor of the Olmsted papers. And Charlie Beveridge is a national treasure. A major recommendation of the master plan was the creation of a not-for-profit that would guide the rehabilitation of the parks. Enter OLPA, the Olmsted Linear Park Alliance. And for over 20 years, my firm has been lucky enough to be involved with with the OLPA, and it has been through 7 major phases, a number of minor phases. It was really handy, number one, that they didn't have all the money they needed initially, so that it could be done incrementally, almost one park segment at a time. Part of the system, part of the process was the removal of those non-historic intrusions that Jenny talked about. And this particular play structure was a thorn in the side or a splinter in the hand of anyone who got near it. And if you ever needed to find a used needle somewhere, this was a pretty good place to look, as well as other intimate acts, representing acts of intimate contact that you just don't really want to know about. When we approached the removal of this playground, it was like, wait a minute. We found a safety expert. He did a 40-page report that detailed over 100 safety violations, and what I am demonstrating here in this picture is one particular issue called entrapment, and I won't detail what is involved in an entrapment accident. Once the report was presented to the OLPA board, the City of Atlanta Parks Department was there. The next day a fence went up. Actually, that afternoon a fence went up, and the next day the structure was removed. It is not that Olmsted or OLPA or me are against playgrounds. It is a question of balancing priorities, and in this instance, the major goal was the recreation of beauty and then finding a place where a playground could be accommodated in a way that did not upset that Olmstedian vista. So it was balancing a series of these different values. And one of the things in this, and so this is the view, on the upper left is the view from Springdale Park into Virgiley Park, and Springdale is on the left, so the view is from A to B, and in the upper right picture, you're looking from B back to A, and what is in between there is this cross street. And if you've been to New York, if you've been to Central Park, you know, of course, that there are 4 cross streets that go through Central Park, and they drop out of view. Of course, there should be a test. I should have asked you, how many cross streets are there in Central Park? Now you know the answer, damn it. But the way Olmsted did it in Central Park was he suppressed the roadway and then built bridges or overpasses, the word that comes up in weather reports all the time. Ask David Chanley sometime about the difference between overpass and a bridge, and he'll just go. But in this instance, you still get the suppression of that cross street, but we're doing it with plant material, and Olmsted was doing it with plant material in the initial planting plan. So it was the restoration of that vista, and in this instance, in the left-hand upper image, the playground is behind that planting. So we were able to accommodate the need and restore the Olmsted vista, and do it in a way that is safe, which I think was a major goal. Oak Grove Park was actually the first one that we tackled. That had to do with the availability of the first money, which was perhaps ironically or paradoxically provided by a grant from GDOT. I know, it was like, what? And Tally Sweat, longtime president and board chair emeritus, and Alita Silverman, a self-proclaimed citizen loudmouth, and a longtime board member of the National Association of Olmsted Parks, sat at her kitchen table and went through this grant application, put it together, and they got it. That's just not the way it works. Then we have Shady Side, which is an unusual, little narrow sliver of a park as it rounds the corner and gets to Clifton Road. And then Dellwood ends the first phase, the pastoral park segment ends with Dellwood. And Dellwood is sort of the sister park to Springdale. It's also about 5 acres, and it's where you get the sense of these Olmstedian vistas. Anybody been to Prospect Park in Brooklyn? Yeah? So many Olmsted enthusiasts consider Prospect Park better than Central Park. Don't say that in Manhattan. But in Brooklyn, they are justly proud. But it's that big open space is what characterizes so many Olmsted landscapes. But the other component that does also resonate so strongly with Olmsted is that valuing of the picturesque, and that we saw with Yosemite. And a thin volume, Olmsted at Yosemite by Rolf Diamant and Ethan Carr. It is a fascinating book. Deepdene is about half of the total park systems, and it doesn't have the drama of Yosemite, but like the north end of Central Park, was left more or less untouched, with paths built in the interior to allow ease of access. Olmsted, when he was writing about the more picturesque wild parts of Central Park, noted that it, quote, already was the highest ideal that could be aimed at for a park under any circumstances, and that it should be interfered with as little as possible. This was Olmsted's general approach to wild land. Deepdene has a deep cleft in the center and a wonderful stream there. Deepdene, along with Fernbank Forest and the forest at Cater-Wilford Gardens, they're sisters. These are triplets that were perhaps once conjoined, that have been separated by the development that's happened around them. They are a remnant of the great eastern deciduous forest that covered our country east of the Mississippi. This rugged, rough topography made logging by early pioneers really difficult, so these remnants were left alone. It wasn't out of the goodness of their heart, it was just too hard to extract the resources out of it. There are several poplars in Deepdene that tower well over 100 feet in height and approach 200 years of age. Olmsted recognized the need for this preservation early on in 1892. So this one, hold on to your hats, because this just blows me away. All right, so this is 1968, Summer of Love, not everywhere. So the purple vermicelli is the highway that GDOT, in their wet dreams, was trying to get through. Am I going too far with that? I'm sorry. I know, I just can't retract the clause. So I'm going to step away from the mic. I think you can still hear me. Just a wild guess. So this is Scott Boulevard streaming down through here, and the railroad bridge is somewhere right in here. And then this is all of Deepdene Park, and this is Fernbank Forest. And somehow we're connecting over hill through dale. You know, we don't know if they're going to bridge the chasm, the gorge of Deepdene, or if they're going to fill it. Either way, it would have been denatured. Then you come across Delwood, and then you come across Jenny's house 1 is here, Jenny's house 2 is there. They're gone. Would have made her a millionaire. She'd just gone high rise. Then we've got Delwood is gutted. These all, South Ponds becomes sort of an on-ramp. And then on into the city. It's a tough one. There are a lot of, the mid-century modern conjures these beautiful images of Don Draper and Twiggy and Audrey Hepburn and James Bond and Babe Paley, but the ugly underside of mid-century life was not just day drinking. It was also the explosion of the scenes on the scene of highways, obliterating historic cores of American neighborhoods or American cities, and the way they were used to reinforce racial divisions. There are many unspoken assumptions about highways, and it is tough to make them apolitical. But golly, were they trying to bring residents to downtown to work? Were they trying to fuel an escape from the inner city at a time when racial segregation was being dismantled? Yes, and yes, and yeah. So the other five parks have been rehabilitated largely. The pattern we've seen, it's working, but OLPA was faced with how do we approach Deepdene? And truly, when we finally got to Deepdene, Sally Harbaugh said, we never thought we'd get to Deepdene. It was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? There were a number of problems. There was uncontrolled stormwater, and the image on the upper right is called a scour pit, and it is big. It is probably the size of from me to that window, and it is not as high as the ceiling, but it is 12 feet deep. Yeah. We also have uncontrolled invasive exotics. I'll go on the record here. I am not against soccer, but when you put a fixed goal in place that can't be moved, you can't adjust wear patterns. And then, all right, I'm also not against hooved animals or hoofed animals. As I've looked at this so many times, and I was so stunned by hooved animals that it was Jenny just last week who said, hooved is actually spelled wrong. And I was like, God, you're right. But we still don't know, even though you can't bring in a hooved animal, are they against ruminants or ungulates or both? I don't know. It's just, they're like these questions that I really want to know. So as we dug into Deep Dean, one of the things that we addressed was that erosion. So January 2007 is the before picture. March 2012 is the veil, and that is the way we've addressed stormwater. April 2007, it's under construction. And we used a technique called the Rosgen Natural Stream Restoration Technique. Not long after it was built, there was a 500-year storm, and it worked. And it is still there in the bottom of the picture, 2020. I have a hard time, and we drew the drawings. We were there during construction. I have a hard time figuring out where one point where it starts and stops. So we've got some grainy pictures of Sally and Tally. Tally Sweat is in the houndstooth. Sally Harbaugh is on the right in red, and that's Norman, her husband, behind. I call them the dream team. They led to the implementation of the master plan, the growth of this really important nonprofit board, and the fostering of this alliance between the City of Atlanta, DeKalb County, Fernbank, and the bulk of the pastoral parks are owned by the City of Atlanta. Fernbank owns most of Delwood and all of Deep Dean and leases it back to DeKalb County. So it really is this alliance of these groups. I consider Sally to be the soul of the movement, while Tally is its spirit. And soul and spirit, the words are used interchangeably. They're not the same. Soul to me is a feminine energy. Soul is eternal. Soul is patient and has no time, sort of like me when I get a microphone in my hand. But soul waits for you to get the message. Now later on, now or later, soul doesn't care. Are you going to get the message or not? Spirit is another story. It is fast, it is energetic, it's masculine, it's active, it is fleeting, it is explosive, it is vibrant, it can be killed, it can be crushed. Spirit seeks soul, and soul waits to be found. Both of these energies were essential to the rehabilitation of these parks. Without Sally, who camped out in front of the office of the powerful head of GDOT and was dismissed as a bored housewife by the press. I mean, can you believe that? It was in the newspaper. I mean, a bored housewife. She would just hang out there going, there's something going on here, and it really sucks. She would never use that language, never. But without Sally and that persistence, none of this would have happened. Without Tally, it is unlikely that over $10 million would have been raised for this work. The parks received some limited support from Atlanta and DeKalb, but the majority of the funds for the construction of the work has been privately raised and volunteer-driven. So here is a book that may be familiar to you. I know Ken Thomas knows this book. It's the iconic Garden History of Georgia, first published in 1933. It's been reprinted as the bicentennial project of the Garden Club of Georgia in 1976. And it was championed by a member of the Peachtree Garden Club and a Druid Hills resident named Lorraine Cooney. And so the letter up there, and I picked out some critical parts there, she's writing to the Olmsted firm in 1932, And so she says, many years ago, probably 20, I am told that you landscaped a section of Atlanta, which is now the most beautiful residential section of the city, in spite of the fact that it has been neglected. Lorraine, in a way, like Sally, lived facing this same segment of park, Dellwood, and she's been told that maybe the Olmsted firm was involved. Maybe? So in 20 years, this thread of history had already been lost. For Lorraine, there was a hint of something, a poorly remembered poem or song, something. Was it simply beauty, soul? In the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, the writer Thomas Cahill described how literacy was lost in short 2 generations after the fall of Rome. In 2 generations, library books were burned for fuel because people didn't know what they were. The park had matured. That sort of thing seemed to have been happening for Lorraine's time. No one knew for sure that Olmsted had been involved. The park had matured at this point, at any rate, at a rate that's similar to the way a family matures. And Lorraine knew something, there was an underlying beauty that she could sense, that there was something at risk, there was some thread that was being lost. And sadly, because of her discretion, she says she's not going to mention this to anyone. He's like, damn it. The dream flickered and was extinguished, but she left us this important legacy in this important book that I turn to. Mine is almost falling apart. This is a part of Deepdene that we call the promenade. It is a simple pedestrian path, wide enough to be comfortable, far enough back from the street to feel safe. We built it right where the desire line, right where the worn pathway was, which was the first clue that, oh, this is where people actually feel safe because they're 20 feet or so back from the cars that are driving too fast. But it also sits where the trolley tracks were supposed to be. So now this work, you know, the ironies just blow me away. It was created with the coordinated, cordial collaboration with GDOT. Who'd have thunk it? The photograph in the upper right shows how the power lines had proliferated. I mean, power lines were like, they were the cobra heads. I mean, it was just, and it required the shearing of the forest edge because Georgia Power must have its way. This is not a place anybody wants to be. Now, afterwards, there aren't any people there because it was during the pandemic. It was like there are no cars on the street. But what we've shown on the right, on the lower right, is this was the construction drawing that we did as this to help guide this. Now the green circle was where at the time GDOT said, we'll build a storm drain where that green circle is, and we're going to take it past the forest and we'll empty it into a place that everybody agreed was going to work. 2018 or so, they come back and say, no, we can't do that. We've got to put the storm drain in the red circle, and we have to tear down all of the tulip poplars, and we have to tear up all of the utilities that have been built in that very spot. And we're going to take the water where that blue line is and dump it into Deepdene. It was like, for the love of God, we used GDOT money to build it this way because you agreed. And, you know, so the millipede, the head gets chopped off and the back legs just keep on marching, and they have no idea what's going on. So it's not that I care or anything, sorry. So now there has been movement, and it's very hopeful because Fernbank jumped in, OLPA, a lot of conversation back and forth. And right now, GDOT has pressed the pause button and said, maybe let's not do that. Let's rethink this. So I am hopeful about that. Lorraine's 20 years, loss of literacy, and this tenuous thread of history. So I'm wrapping it up. I got no more slides. So, get the hook. Beauty is eternal, but it is fragile and requires vigilance, and it requires champions. Will our current generation, back to Jenny's point, So enamored of Instagram and TikTok, will they pick up the mantle or will they miss the handoff and drop the baton? There's reason for hope, perhaps. It's handy that Senator Ossoff attended Paideia right across the street from Oak Grove Park and has reportedly bought a house in Druid Hills. There's work to do. There is no time to rest. Gary Kasparov, the retired chess grandmaster and the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, was speaking at Goucher College recently, and he said, when the Cold War was won back in 1991, we forgot a simple thing, that the evil doesn't die. It grows back through the cracks in our apathy. It grows back through the cracks in our apathy. Thank you for your presence, for your attention, and for your deep caring. And I thank you for your presence. So, thank you. We may have talked right over the Q&A time, but or people are exhausted or hungry. So you tell me, Marissa.
I mean, the question is, but we do have books for sale, so we don't want to not let you walk away with a book. So,
Great.
feel free to do
As
that.
well as beverages. If I haven't driven you to drink, I mean, now's the time. All right, thank you all. No questions? No, for Jenny? Yeah.
I just want to say thank you both for what you've done. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Your work.
It's a privilege.
Absolutely. It's a privilege to be involved and to actually touch this stuff. And the more I learn about Olmsted, the more it's like, no, he's amazing. So, all right, yeah. He had a hand in the initial conversations about the Cotton States Exposition. The leadership there didn't exactly like what he suggested, and so he went away and they hired someone else. They used some of his ideas, but not the good ones. So, yeah. Who designed Grant Park? The Olmsted brothers were involved. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Others? There was actually, the Olmsted brothers came in and they had a couple of different contracts. One was at Piedmont Park, one was at Grant Park, one was at Mims Park, and another one which was on the west side, and another was at Prevailed Park in Inman Park. And then a number of other projects that they started in Atlanta but didn't come to fruition. All right, thank you all.